boxes, this came into question again, but in 2017, the ESRB decided that loot boxes were not considered gambling to them and were fair game. For the gambling moniker, there's only a few examples we can actually look to. For instance, Peak Entertainment Casinos actually got the rating of AO, or gambling, which seemingly is in line for what Peak Entertainment expected when they released the game. Matter of fact, their public relations manager even stated in a press release that getting that ESRB rating of adults only was exactly what they wanted. The whole AO and M rated system isn't the only thing, though, that has shaped other games within the gaming industry either. Video game journalist Ben Kuchera actually noted that a sci-fi FPS game like Halo 3, whose level of violence in his opinion was comparable to that of Star Wars, would receive an M rating for blood, gore, mild language, and violence, and felt that it was odd that a game like Halo 3 shared the same rating as Saints Row 4, which carries the blood, intense violence, partial nudity, sexual content, strong language, and use of drugs descriptor. Similarly, he pointed out that Saints Row and Halo get this M rating, though content in a PG-13 film like The Dark Knight could come across as harsher to children than that of a Saints Row game, pointing out ultimately that parents should be able to decide and know what's right and not right for their children. But yeah, he does bring up an interesting point. Is Halo 3 really that much darker and unsuitable for children than the PG-13 movie The Dark Knight? Also, of course, with Halo being an interesting example of people typically thinking that Halo was never fully deserving or needing an M rating, Halo 5 Guardians would be the first Halo game to pursue a teen rating instead of a M rating. And in the process of trying to reduce the violence and some of the other things that was peaking Halo over into the M rating direction, Halo 5 would get the T rating, though it seemed like the things that they had to change were pretty big sacrifices that ended in no real major result. Like, multiplayer's still there, except there's no quote-unquote killing because it's all just like a simulation game now. It was really weird. Also, after a while, ESRB started doing disclaimers that online interactions were not rated by the ESRB just because of the rise of voice communications, and, jumping on Modern Warfare 2, you can be called any name under the sun, and how's the ESRB supposed to put a fair rating for something like that? They want their hands clean from that, so they put that disclaimer. Ratchet & Clank's an interesting game. It got rated T by the ESRB despite being intended for children and receiving lower ratings from other boards in different countries. Like, it got a G rating from the ACB. Soldier of Fortune's interesting because in a rare occurrence, the Canadian province of Ontario actually overrode the ESRB rating and awarded the game their own quote-unquote restricted rating, as they felt like the extreme violence was too much for minors to have access to. This leads us into a whole other discussion when it comes to international rating systems. Lots of countries in Europe, like the UK, France, Spain, etc., use the PEGI system for rating their games, which stands for Pan-European Game Information. Essentially, this age rating bracket starts off at the age of 3, which is suited for all age groups, and then goes 7, 12, 16, and 18, with 18 being for adults only. Then, just like the ESRB has, there's content descriptors that say what is in the game, like bad language, drugs, horror, gambling, sex, violence, and in-game purchases and discrimination. What? If there's any gambling in it, it's an automatic 12 rating, which most notably affected some of the Pokemon games in the past. If you remember, some of the remakes of Pokemon games actually lacked the game corners that originally were in the game, and when games like Red and Blue re-released on the 3DS, they actually were rated PEGI 12 because of the gambling. Now, what is interesting though is that NBA 2K actually got up into controversy in 2019 when hyping up their new release by showing a bunch of loot boxes in the trailer, and the rating wasn't changed, with PEGI making a statement saying that the gambling descriptor only applies to content that teaches and encourages gambling. So Pokemon's not okay because it's fake gambling, but spending real money on loot boxes makes total sense. Then there's Germany, on the other hand, which is one of the few countries in Europe that has their own rating system called the USK, which stands for this word. This one starts at the young age of 0, for all age groups, then it goes 6, 12, 16, 18. Now, Luke grew up with the system and is much stricter than other countries from his experience. Halo, for example, was mostly rated 18, so adults only, same with Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto 5, Battlefield, and basically most shooters. The original Doom was even banned from sales in Germany, which wasn't lifted until 2011. Now, there also used to be some censoring that would have made for games to release in Germany and get a USK rating. For example, in Left 4 Dead 2, the bodies would fade away when you kill zombies, and in games like the Wolfenstein reboot, guns had to be replaced by something different. Nowadays, Germany's actually much more lax, and the last Wolfenstein even was allowed to have these German Beyblades for the context of like historical accuracy or context for a story. And Left 4 Dead 2 eventually did get a patch that updated the game back to the normal version. Now, these also have content descriptors as well, like for stuff like alcohol, violence, drugs, etc. But there are a few interesting ones, like a bunch of subcategories for violence, all on top of the normal violence moniker. Essentially, it's rating how realistic the violence in the game is. Obviously, there'll be a bigger disclaimer if it covers a topic of a word we probably can't say in the video, but you guys get the point. Okay, then on the other hand, there's still another video game market, which is Japan, and they have their own rating system as well. Now, their rating system actually starts for A, which is all ages, which could cause some confusion from what the ESRB does, with A being like the worst thing. Then they have B, which is for ages 12 and up. Then it goes C, which is 15, D, which is 17, and Z, which is 18 and up. There are some content warnings that get printed on the box, like other rating systems have, explaining some descriptors of the game. And then on top of that, there are still some restrictions as to what can actually be featured in the game itself. For instance, one of the biggest notable causes in recent years was Last of Us 2, which had a sex scene cut out of the Japanese version, and then still got that Z18+ rating. Also, recently in 2022, Callisto Protocol developers refused to make changes to their game for the Japanese market, and because of that, the game wasn't able to get rated and wasn't released traditionally in Japan. Alright, and then you know what location does have some really interesting laws and rating systems when it comes to video games? China. Yeah. Over in China, they have a video game rating system known as the Online Game Ethics Committee, and the OGEC is responsible for reviewing and rating video games. Now, the committee is actually a part of the Greater State Administration of Press and Publication, which is a government agency that oversees the regulation of, in this case, video games specifically in the country. Now, one thing that's interesting though is China doesn't have a traditional age-based rating system like those found in other countries like the ESRB or PEGI. Instead, the OGEC primarily focuses on content evaluation, which includes elements of violence, sexual content, gambling, and politically sensitive topics. It's also worth noting that all video games released in China must undergo content review and obtain an official license from the OGEC before they can be legally sold or distributed within the country. Now, on top of all of that, the Chinese government has also implemented certain measures and guidelines, which applies to online games and imposes restrictions on the amount of time that kids can spend playing games. Now, these restrictions are enforced through real name registration and identity verification process. Under this anti-addiction system, players below 18 years old are typically limited to a certain number of hours of gameplay per day and may have further restrictions depending on things like if it's a school day or not. For a long time, the Chinese government imposed a ban on the sale of video game consoles. The ban was placed all the way back in 2000 and ran all the way until 2014. During this ban, the sale and distribution of consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64 were actually prohibited in China, and as a result, these consoles did not have an official presence in the Chinese market. During the mid-2000s, there was a time period where Nintendo tried to circumvent some of these console bans by teaming up with other third-party companies to get their games to players in China. For instance, there was a device known as the iQ Player, which was a video game developed by iQ, a Chinese company and a subsidiary of Nintendo. It was released in 2003 and designed specifically for that Chinese market, and the iQ Player was a unique system to say the least. It offered a localized and cost-effective way for Chinese gamers to get to experience Nintendo games. Partially released because of the fact that Nintendo games were very popular in a bootleg form during these years where Nintendo wasn't getting official releases over there. Now, the iQ primarily featured games from Nintendo's back catalog, including titles from popular franchises like Mario and Zelda and Pokemon. There was even a special rare Animal Crossing game that released on this console. If you didn't know we have an Animal Crossing channel, just throw that out there here. Now, unfortunately though, the iQ ended up not really doing all that well, but originally was mostly just an aim at Nintendo to bolster the reputation of them as a video game publisher and to attempt to show that Nintendo games could be educational and a positive experience for younger players. But ultimately, the iQ didn't get the popularity that Nintendo had hoped for. In 2013, the Chinese ministry banned Battlefield 4 as they claimed it misrepresented China and was an attempt to smear China's image. And then, of course, in 2014, when the ban was officially lifted, which allowed consoles to be sold legally in China, by this point the market had already evolved and newer console generations had taken over and gaming had become massive in China. We saw a ton of attempts during this time though from Western video game companies trying to get their foot in the Chinese market. Halo the Master Chief Collection would release on Xbox over in China. It would have some massive censorship added into the game to try to appease the OGEC. One of the biggest examples being the Flood will like shrink and disappear when you defeat them, and also a lot of the cutscenes were altered or framed differently to not interfere with some of the rating requirements that China has. Now, in more recent years, Nintendo has made efforts to re-enter the Chinese market, and besides a few years ago doing some interesting partnership with Nvidia, the Nintendo Switch was officially released in China in late 2019 through a partnership deal with the Chinese-based company Tencent. This became an interesting talking point for Nintendo fans across the board because in 2020, when you looked at the eShop available in China for the Nintendo Switch, there were 3 games available that had been approved for Chinese markets. So it just shows that there was a lot of scrutiny and work that goes into getting games approved for market there. In 2020, also Animal Crossing released, and that game became a massive hit for the Nintendo Switch and fans around the world. I mean, this is like the second best-selling Nintendo Switch game for context, just under Mario Kart. And with the lockdown that happened in 2020, a lot of people jumped to Animal Crossing to voice their opinions about many different things, one of those being the big Hong Kong protests, and a lot of Chinese players dedicated their island to the Free Hong Kong movement. In turn, China's government ended up choosing to ban Animal Crossing from China altogether, and the game is just not available anymore. Nowadays, it's interesting to see that there's just a handful of Nintendo Switch games actually available in China to buy and play on your Nintendo Switch, and it's just kind of a far cry from the library that's available in other countries. Persona 5 has like a mobile game that's releasing exclusively in China as of now, and this is technically a spin-off of the main Persona 5 story. Also, interestingly enough, they changed some things that typically have skull imagery and replaced them. However, the character Skull himself retains the same name. There's a big restriction when it comes to imageries of skulls, interestingly enough, in China and in video games. There was a lot of fan outcry a few years back with Rainbow Six Siege, a multiplayer game, when the developers stated that they had plans of pushing the game into Chinese markets and in turn would be removing certain references and aesthetics from the game to best fit into the requirements for a Chinese market. But to take out things like skulls in a game where there's like skulls on the wall, there's a character that has like a skull as their face, there'd be a lot of other little references and things they'd have to remove also to get the game greenlit and approved for Chinese markets. Fans felt like they were just sacrificing too much of what the game originally was intended to be, and eventually Ubisoft ended up changing their mind based off of the fan backlash. Now, overall, when it comes to ratings in games across the board in any country, we all know that the main organizations that handle the rating systems definitely leave a lot to be desired, and you can really be on either side of the fence with this. You could be a concerned parent not wanting their kids to have access to a really violent video game, or you can be a gamer who feels like these restrictions limit what a game developer is able to put into their game, which would violate free speech or free expression. Where these two sides come together, though, is that the ESRB or PEGI, they don't really do a good job here. There's too many times where the ESRB has gone too harsh on games that definitely don't deserve the higher rating that it has, and then there's also been times where the ESRB has failed at listing some of the things that are featured on the game's disclosures. This has grown into a distrust between consumers and this organization, leaving most parents and players to really not trust what the ESRB is saying is the right rating. Like, let's look at Call of Duty, for example. Between Modern Warfare 2 and Black Ops 2, Call of Duty was at its peak in popularity. And if you were in voice chat, you knew. Majority of the people playing the game were not 17. Matter of fact, a lot of them weren't even like 12. Sure, some people might argue that it was bad parenting to let a teenager play Call of Duty, but the success of Call of Duty shows that parents are willing to look at a game that has that rating and be like, nah, I don't agree with what the ESRB is saying. I think that my kid is mature enough to handle these topics. And this exact scenario happened to millions of players in that period of time. Nobody takes the ESRB seriously. Now, obviously, it's great that the ESRB isn't like the implications that China has for their gaming audience. There's also an interesting ABC News article from a few years back talking about the ESRB and their rating systems, and this quote we just found was really interesting. My son sees violence and terrorism on the news daily, knows it's reality, and technology, video games, allow him to act as one of the good guys battling terrorists. From Andrew Rhodes, a father of a 10-year-old gamer and a gamer himself, who wrote in an email, when I was his age, all the kids in our neighborhood regularly played war with toy guns, we watched old World War II movies, and had Vietnam live on television. So for a long time, there's been the sentiment that video games cause violence, which there has been numerous studies done that disprove those claims. It's interesting how a lot of the times other outlets don't get the same scrutiny, like news media, television, movies, books, only those darn video games, even though there's these studies to back up the very opposite of a lot of those claims. And of course, I think there should be restrictions in place to protect children, but the ESRB isn't cutting it. I genuinely don't know what the solution is and how things should proceed moving forward, so maybe we should open up the discussion. Does anyone have good ideas on how games should be handled when it comes to the rating system? We've identified the problem, how do we come up with a better solution? Leave your comments down below. Also, listen, if you need something good to drink, it's time you go ahead and pick up some GamerSups. We have an affiliate link with them, so if you use our code, we get a little cut of your order, and I genuinely love GamerSups. I drink that every day, multiple times a day, and I used to be the type of person to like never drink water, so this will help us support our channel and videos like this. Also, a huge shout out to our patrons. Thanks everyone for supporting our channel and, keeping us afloat. Make sure you guys are subscribing to notifications on. That's it for today. We'll see you all next time with a new video.